Hello YouTubers, Alaska Prepper here. A while back, I'm not sure, I think it was on a live stream, or it may have been on one of my Patreon live streams. I tried to explain that the biggest threat is not really the Dow Jones crashing. So that the biggest threat that we face is not really that the markets will crash, but that the biggest threat that we face is our debt market, our bonds. And I try to explain that the best that I can. And I noticed that this article that came out today explains it very well. So I wanted to go ahead and share this with you. That way you can understand exactly why it is that our debt market is really what we should be concerned with and looking at as a precursor to the stock markets and the equities markets collapsing. The title of this article reads, "Will 2021 be the year that the world loses faith in the US dollar?" Nearly 186 years ago, to the week, on January 8, 1835, President Andrew Jackson accomplished what no other American president has done before or since. He paid off the national debt. Jackson despised the banks, and according to his biographer, he considered central banking and the national debt a moral failing. So he paid it all off, roughly $5 million. That was the first and only time that the U.S. national debt was zero. Then by the end of 1835, the debt had already increased to $33,000. And within 3 years, it was $3.3 million. And then by 1847, it had increased to $33 million. The trajectory continued. The national debt crossed $1 billion for the first time during the Civil War. Then $10 billion for the first time during World War I. Then $100 billion for the first time during World War II. It crossed $1 trillion for the first time during the peak of the Cold War in the early 1980s. And it crossed $10 trillion for the first time in 2008 after years of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, followed by a financial crisis. The national debt is now nearly $28 trillion, which is 40% larger than the U.S. economy. I'd be surprised if it didn't hit 30 trillion by the end of the first quarter. Last year alone, the debt grew by $4.5 trillion due to this health crisis. Why does this matter? Because sooner or later, that debt is going to mature and it will need to be paid back. And this is where they go into, ladies and gentlemen, into explaining to us why the debt market is more important to look at than the actual equities markets, i.e. the stock markets. The way it works now is that whenever an investor buys a government bond, usually when the bond matures, they just roll it over to a new bond. Meaning that they don't want to cash the money out. They don't want to cash that bond out for money. This way, the government doesn't have to actually pay anyone back. They just keep refinancing and kicking the can down the road, farther into the future. And the Treasury Department is praying that bondholders will consider to continue this practice forever. Unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen. For starters, foreign governments like China and Japan, which are among the biggest owners of U.S. government debt, have already started reducing their holdings. In February, just prior to the health crisis gripping the world, foreigners owned $7.23 trillion worth of U.S. government bonds, approximately 30% of the national debt. By October, the total amount had fallen slightly to $7.07 trillion, but as a percentage, foreigner ownership had dropped to about 25% from 30%. This is not an earth-shattering decline, but it shows a clear unwillingness from foreign governments to buy more U.S. government debt, and also that some of them would like to be repaid when their existing bonds mature. So what this is saying, ladies and gentlemen, is that they're not necessarily selling their bonds into the market. They're just letting their bonds expire and wanting to get paid for what those bonds promised them at the end of their expiration. Just look at China. After years of rising tensions, China has gradually reduced its holdings of U.S. debt from a peak of $1.32 trillion in November of 2013 to $1.07 trillion by October of 2020. And it's unlikely that China will suddenly have a fit of generosity and choose to extend their U.S. Treasury holdings. Meaning that once the bonds that they have come to maturity, ladies and gentlemen, they're going to start asking for that back. And how is the U.S. going to pay them back for those matured bonds? They're going to print money. And then they're going to give China the money. And what's China going to do with those dollars? They're going to spend those dollars before those dollars become worth less. Aside from foreign governments, another major holder of U.S. government debt is, guess ladies and gentlemen, Social Security program. In other words, us, the U.S. citizens. Social Security built up enormous cash reserves over the years in its various trust funds. And those trust funds are 100% invested in U.S. government bonds. Traditionally, Social Security always buys new bonds whenever its existing bonds mature, so they keep refinancing the debt from the U.S. government. But now, Social Security has a huge problem. The trust funds are rapidly running out of money. Previously, the Treasury Secretary estimated that Social Security trust funds would be fully depleted by 2034, and that was prior to this health crisis, ladies and gentlemen. But this health crisis has ravaged Social Security's finances. Unemployment has surged, countless businesses closed, and payroll taxes were suspended. In other words, there was no money being paid into the trust funds. At the same time, Social Security payments increased. Even more people have retired and started collecting benefits. So while Social Security inflows went to zero, the outflows went up. And some analysts now estimate that the program's trust funds could be fully depleted as early as 2029 because of the adverse impact of this health crisis. Ladies and gentlemen, that's probably why you've been hearing the word reset, and that's probably why you've been hearing the phrase, we need to have a new Bretton Woods. I've been hearing that a lot lately, and I'm sure you have as well. It's because, ladies and gentlemen, we are broke. The world is broke. We have printed, as a world, so much fiat, so many promissory notes, that those people that pull the strings are realizing that all of the energy that it's going to take to pay back all of that fiat currency that's been printed can never be done. It's impossible. So now they need to start a new Bretton Woods and or have a reset of the system. So needless to say, Social Security will need to be paid back when its treasury bonds mature in the coming years. As it turns out, $8 trillion worth of government debt in the U.S. will mature this year alone. Plus, the Congressional Budget Office expects another $2 trillion deficit this year due to more stimulus. Ladies and gentlemen, I think they're undercutting it by saying another $2 trillion. I would say probably about another $5 to $10 trillion this year. So that's potentially $10+ trillion worth of government debt that will need to be placed this year. That's $300,000 per second. The only way they'll realistically accomplish this is if the Federal Reserve prints trillions of dollars of new money. The Fed did this last year, ladies and gentlemen. In January of 2020, the Federal Reserve owned $2.3 trillion worth of government debt. Meaning that the government wrote a bond, said, give me this much money, gave it to the Fed printed up the money and gave it to the government. And today they own $4.7 trillion, more than twice as much, for a total balance sheet of $7 trillion. So they have $4.7 trillion in government debt, meaning that the government borrowed that money from the Fed. And then the rest is all of your other securities, like, for example, mortgage-backed securities, equities that they bought through loopholes by hiring banks to buy equities from the market and then buying bundles off of the banks and things like that. So the Fed conjured money out of thin air and expanded the money supply by roughly 25% last year. Then they used that money to buy back U.S. government bonds. They'll have to do it again this year and create trillions of dollars more. It is rather interesting that Janet Yellen is the incoming Secretary of the Treasury. She used to be the Fed chair, and during her tenure, she oversaw unprecedented money printing programs, which tells us, well, ladies and gentlemen, that when she takes office again in her position, she will be more than likely to encourage the government to continue to print like there's no tomorrow. And ladies and gentlemen, that is what continuous money printing leads to. No tomorrow. So there will be likely plenty of cooperation between the Fed and the Treasury to print absurd quantities of money this year. Certainly there will be some bondholders who extend their securities, but most likely the Fed will need to print another $3+ trillion, pushing its balance sheet beyond $10 trillion mark. And if we go down this path, ladies and gentlemen, where we have $30 trillion worth of debt, and the Federal Reserve has a balance sheet of $10 trillion plus, then in this year, by the end of this year, 2021, it could be the year that the world finally loses confidence in the dollar. Because, ladies and gentlemen, The world is watching what we're doing. I know that emerging markets love that the dollar is weaker, that the dollar is weakening, because whenever emerging markets, and what I mean by emerging markets is like countries outside of the US, like third world countries that take out loans in dollars, but have to pay those loans back in dollars, meaning that if the dollar is stronger, it takes more of their currency to convert into dollars to be able to pay back the loans. But if the dollar is weaker, it takes less of their currency to be able to convert into dollars to pay back the loans. So emerging markets love it when the dollar is weaker. However, if the dollar gets too weak, where it can't buy much compared to the previous years, other countries and the world as a whole could lose confidence in the dollar. All right, ladies and gentlemen, having said that, I hope you got something out of this. Protect yourselves however you can. I like to purchase real assets. I like to be out of the system as much as I can. Why? Because if the system goes down, I can rely on myself and I can rely on the things that I have to allow me and my family to continue to live the standard of living that we are used to living now. Having said that, I hope you have a great day. Remember to be good to each other. When good people do good things happen. Remember to reach one, teach one, and repeat. If we all did this, the world would be a better place, and you know that it will be a better place. Many blessings to all of you and your families. This is The Last Prepper. I am out.